Thank you for coming to this. I've spoken a lot of times at different events, and this is my first attempt at a PowerPoint presentation on my own. Usually my nephew helps me and sets everything up, so if something looks terrible or out of alignment, I apologize, but hey, I'm a rookie going through this, so bear with me if you can. I've tried to keep this really short and sweet. They keep asking me, what do you want to do it on? What do you want to do it on? It's like my mind is going 100 times, 100 RPMs. I figured what I would do is, and since I have just an hour really to do something, I try to keep it relatively simple and something that has a Port Huron tie-in besides just shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. Today we're gonna do 3 different ships. There were all 3 of them. The one thing they had the 2 things they had in common. Number one, they were all built here in Port Huron. Jenks Shipbuilding in town built them, and all 3 of them ended up with serious disasters with a large amount of lives lost. So I mean, whether the Jenks, whether you spell it Jenks or Jinx, it kind of might be that might have been part of the reason why they had so much trouble. But without further ado, I'll explain as to what I'm doing. And anytime you guys have any questions, or if you think of something that I said wrong or did wrong, just feel free to ask me. I'm not an absolute authority on everything. I just have fun. I've been boat crazy since a little kid. I have an interest in ships, and so this is just kind of a continuation of it. I collect primarily slides of the ships on the lakes. I don't collect a lot of photographs, so a lot of the photographs have been taken off the internet, and there was a few that I've taken in here, and so I apologize if the resolution isn't really great. I didn't know how big a screen or anything I was going to be showing these on. They'll be adequate for here. If you have any questions anytime, like I said, feel free to ask away, and I'll do my best to answer. Okay, that's an excellent question. Jenks Shipbuilding first started building ships here in Port Huron in 1889, primarily at the start, of course, wooden hulls and barges. It sat right, it'd be in the parking lot of the Zebra Bar is where it was at right there. It was right on the corner of where Lapeer Road would be, or Lapeer Avenue, and Quay Street right there. So it's right there, or should we say Erie and Quay Street is actually where it was at. It was a very simple little yard. It didn't have, you think of like American shipbuilding or something, buildings everywhere, and they didn't have it. They were rather small Spartan buildings and things, not rather relatively unobtrusive, for being a shipyard. They like I said, they started in 1889, and they built a series of some tugs and some barges and some sailing ships. I'm sorry? They were built in the building. No, they were actually built right out on the shore and side launched into Black River. Oh, okay. That's where they were built. It started in 1900 with the steel steamer Ravenscraig. That was their first attempt at building a steel vessel, and she was only about 330 feet long, 340 feet long. She's not a particularly big steamer. They built her, and then in short succession, they built a series of steamers. One would be John B. Cowell right here. Captain Thomas Wilson was their first big vessel at 427 feet long. Another vessel that we'll explain here, Henry Steinbrenner, also at 427 feet long. John B. Cowell at basically the same length, 400. They were all the biggest ones. Samuel F.B. Squire was also about the same length. The reason, one of the biggest drawbacks with Jenks Shipbuilding was the location of where they were at. At the time, the Military Street Bridge was a turn-in-the-middle type bridge. It didn't lift up like the drawbridges that we have today, so they were limited to the width that they could get the boats out. And they found about 50 feet there was only about 52 feet or so between the shore and the turning pylon for the bridge. So they could only build boats 50 feet wide, really, and within a very few years, they became obsolete. Their last big ships like this was built in 1903. By 1905, boats were 60 feet in width. You know what I'm saying? So very shortly, the yard actually became obsolete. The other vessel in the middle that we'll do is probably the most famous vessel or infamous vessel on the Great Lakes, next to maybe the Fitzgerald of the modern people today alive that will still remember, but it's the passenger steamer Eastland. which has the dubious distinction of the most lives, 835 people lost on it. That was their only attempt at building a passenger vessel. So like I said, they weren't in business a real long time. In 1903, the Samuel F.B. Squire was the last big ship that they built. I don't think they really went into a receivership then, but they sold the company, became Port Huron Shipbuilding in 1903. In 1905, they built 2 smaller vessels. I think one of them was a tug, and I think they were a work barge or something. I don't quite remember. And in 1905, they had a devastating fire. It wiped out the shipyard. So the shipyard closed. They decided, well, you know, we'll take the insurance money or whatever and run. They knew they couldn't do anything with that bridge being in the way. So, you know, the big yards, American Shipbuilding and the like, and Wheelers and stuff up at Bay City were starting to build all the bigger, much bigger vessels, 600-foot vessels and things that were, you know, almost 200 feet longer than the ones that they could build here. So the yard became obsolete and it closed, and that was the end of it. And like I said, they only built a small amount of vessels, so it didn't take long before most of the things that said Jenks Shipbuilding vanished. However, believe it or not, there is still one Jenks Shipbuilding built hull still on the Great Lakes. And that was a tug that was built in 1902 called the James R. Elliott. James R. Elliott was the fireboat for the city of Detroit and served that until about the 1930s. In 1935 or so, she was bought and taken up into Georgian Bay to become one of the first ferries up there for Tobermory and things. Everybody know the Cheecham and those? That was kind of a forerunner of that. And she was known as the Normac. And she sailed till 1968 up there, so she sailed for quite a long time. And then she bounced around for a while on the Great Lakes. For many years, she was stationed in Toronto at the foot of Yonge Street as a restaurant, a seafood restaurant. And in 1976, they had, or excuse me, in 1980, she had a problem. She was moored, as she had been doing for 30 years, when the paddle wheel ferry Trillium lost control and couldn't stop and collided with her and sank her right to the bottom of the harbor right there. They raised her, stripped off all the cabins, and now they had a hull. Well, they eventually rebuilt her, and she's had a lot of different stops. She spent some time in Cleveland and all over. They've rebuilt her about 3 times now with more modern looking cabins, but the hull is still the same, of course. And the last time that I saw her, she was at Port Dalhousie, Ontario, which is the north side near where Lock 1 of the Welland Canal would be, within, say, 10 miles of the lock there. It was the original entrance to the original Welland Canal, Port Dalhousie. And she's a Mexican restaurant there, but she was open exactly 1 week, and then she closed, and she's been closed and been sitting there ever since. So, but the hull is still there. So I'm just saying, we do have one vessel technically that was built in Port Huron that is still around. The hull, at least, is still here with us. So, but I mean, that's it. The rest of the boats are long gone. We even had some of the boats go overseas into saltwater and the like, and then most of them ended up sunk, of course, you know, in either disasters or just normal storms and the like. So that was the end of the Jenks Shipbuilding. That was the end of pretty much the building of ships here in Port Huron. From then on, we were just a receiving port for wood pulp and, you know, things of that nature. And then in many later years, sugar beet pellets and corn gluten and things of that nature. So, and since the Seaway Terminal burnt here a few years ago, there was really not much in the way of commodities here at all anymore. Paper mill don't even get coal in anymore. You know, everything's gas now. So we really don't have much in the way, other than limestone for concrete. We don't really get much in the way of boats around here anymore. So. Yeah. Jenks. Yep. So if you go down near the railroad tracks on 10th right there, you'll see Jenks Street, and that's named for them. So it's named for the yard. So it's named for the gentleman who founded the company. This particular vessel, as we'll get going here, this particular vessel is the steamer John B. Cowell, and we're going to start with it because I put them in chronological order of when something actually happened to him. This vessel here, again, a good example of the steel-hulled shipbuilding that Jenks did at the very end. One of the things about the Jenks ships, they weren't really particularly pretty, if you know what I'm saying. Some boats are really sharp looking, they were very utilitarian in their simple design and things. They did the job. They were very good, they earned their keep. They would carry about 7,000 tons of either coal or iron ore or anything. So they would, they did their job. If you notice in this is a Bob McGreevy drawing here, and this is stating, you notice on the left, on the right, the left-hand side of the vessel, that's Whitefish Point Lighthouse. She sank about 1.5 miles north of there, so and she's in 225 feet of water, so that's where she's at. So it was really nice that Bob put this in the picture. The other difference is she would be downbound in the time when this was taken, and I'll explain it in just a moment. If you notice the gentleman up on the top of the pilot house, back in those days, that's where they actually conducted business on the ship. The wheelsman actually steered the vessel inside the pilot house. But the captain and the lookout or a mate would be up on top of the pilot house giving orders. If you go over to the museum, you'll see these brass tubes in the pilot house, and it was called a cussing box. And the captain would shout down orders to the guy that was steering it, the wheelsman, and he'd make the course changes as needed. In those days, it was very cold. You didn't have heat or air conditioning, so you relied on the wind to give you air conditioning. And you see the Dodger, which is that cloth canvas that they could put around them to help block the wind. And usually the mate or the captain stood in a big box of straw to keep his feet warm. Back in those days, we didn't have the muckalucks or anything that you would have today. But yeah, that would be very typical of a vessel built at the turn of the century. I'm going to try this. Let's see if I can get this to move. That is kind of a decorative device on the steering wheel. Some of the boats had them, some of them didn't. Here's another shot of her, give you an idea of what they look like. Again, just a single pilot house. The cabin in the forward end, that cabin behind the pilot house would have been what we call the Texas. That held the captain's, his office. He would have had a bedroom, and then he'd have a small office like for entertainment or anything. Some of them that had a little bit more room might have had an extra guest cabin for like the owner or the captain's family or something of that nature. Down below it where it says CT for Cowell Transportation, there's a bunch of portholes. That's where the first mate, the second mate, third mate, wheelsman, watchmen, they would have all had cabins down there, little rooms, usually bunked 2 or 3 men to a cabin. And then, of course, aft you have the long canvas cargo hold, and then on the back end, on the stern, you see the cabins back there. That would have, of course, the engines are back there, and you'd had any of the engineers, chief engineer, first, second, third engineer, the cooks, the galley, everything was back there. So on the back end. In that picture right there, probably about 13, 14 feet there, depending on what kind of cargo she's carrying and what time of the season. She may be loaded right down as far as her anchor pockets. She sank in 1909, so that was before the Coast Guard regulated how much the boats could carry, so sometimes the owners would get and they would overload the vessels, and you might even have the pockets underwater, But like that, she would probably be loaded with, as much as she's sticking onto the water above the pocket, she probably would be quite possibly carrying coal, because it wouldn't be a full cargo.
Out in the middle of the lake.
Yeah.
And it was a big storm.
Yes.
How much would that ship flex?
These would flex quite a bit. They were all riveted hulls, and the rivets, of course, allowed the vessels to twist. Most of this steel was about 3/4 of an inch to an inch thick. The old, real good, high-quality steel of the time, the plates were really big. Today we use high tensile steel, which is like paper thin. That's why when a boat runs aground, even in the mud, it has to go in for repairs, because it's like your car, it crumples right up. Now, the old steel, it'd run aground and back off, and away they would go again most time. They didn't even hardly leak most of the time. So, but they would flex, and sometimes they would shear rivets, and everything. If they got in a really bad storm, rivets would pop off, and then you'd have water coming in and things and the like. But most of them you know, pretty durable. Most of them had long lives of 50, 60, 70 years. Yeah. You have, want to guess? No. I'm sorry? No. What those are for when a vessel goes through the locks, it keeps it from scraping the sides. It's so fenders. It's exactly what it is. It's a fender. It's a form of a fender. It's exactly what it is.
When you say pockets on a vessel, what are you referring to? You said they're pockets above.
The anchor pockets, where the anchor is. The hole, and some more modern vessels have an actual rectangular, almost like a hole where the anchor goes up inside, and then we call it an anchor pocket. Yes. Now, she was doing very well until, let me find the date, because I'm not an expert on every single date, but this is a 1909. You're looking at July 12th, 1909. Well, there's a reason being. I want to kind of be on the right date. She was downbound in a fog up above Whitefish Point, and she had the very misfortune of coming in contact with this very large steel steamer named the Isaac M. Scott. This particular vessel was on her maiden voyage, her very first trip, and they had the very misfortune of meeting and colliding in a nasty accident. The Cowell being fully loaded of iron ore, she had about 7,000 ton of iron ore. They didn't have taconite pellets like they do today. Back then, everything was chunk ore. She sank in about 3.5 minutes. Down she went like a stone. The Scott was extremely badly damaged. Matter of fact, there she is at the shipyard. There's the hole in her bow that was caused by the Scott by the collision.
Did owners have insurance on them?
Yes. Back in those days, most of the time, not every instance, but most of the time, yes, you would have an insurance on this. You know, this thing here it is on its maiden voyage, and it's, you know, already in an accident. You know, you could talk about bad drivers, right? But in later, of course, everything goes through court back then for liability, and both the captain on the Scott and the captain on the Cowell lost their license for a period of time because they ran too fast to speed in fog, and of course that's what caused the accident. I'm sorry. Oh, you betcha. Captains has a very a license just like you would as a driving your car, except it has a lot more in detail that you have to keep writing for over and over and over. And you can't just say, hey, I think I'm going to be a captain today. You have to work your way up, either what they call working your way up the Hosspipe, meaning starting as a deckhand and working your way up, or today you're going to a maritime school and graduating with, you come out as a third mate, you end up with a degree as a third mate, and then you still have to work time. You have to maybe 2-3 years as a third mate, and then you can write for the second, and then write for the third, and then get your master's papers.
How much would that ship be worth?
This ship? Back then, this boat here, you're going to laugh, about $250,000. She was 525 feet long, 54 feet wide, so she's one of the larger vessels on the lake. And they knew they were worth about $250,000. But you got to remember, back then, a guy in the shipyard at like a millwright or a carpenter that did like the fine finishing work was making about 9 cents an hour or 8 cents an hour. So $250,000 was a lot of money. Like I said, within a couple weeks, they had the hole patched up, and she was back in service again. Unfortunately, she did not have a very long life. Sorry to say, I don't have many pictures of the John B. Cowell on the surface, at least the first John B. Cowell. So this is what the Cowell looks like today on the bottom. You can see where she's literally broken right into where she was in the accident, right there. This is one of those high resolution side scans. I'm sorry.
Did the crew make it off? Was there any loss of life?
14 drowned and 10 survived. So there was quite a few that passed that drowned. The captain and his son, they were amongst the survivors. Like I say, she sank in 3 minutes, so it was pretty darn quick. And of course, Lake Superior is never very warm. The water was probably 45 degrees or so, maybe 50 degrees. So you get in that water. Especially ships have a tendency that very few, especially if people get in the water, very few people on the back end in the engine room in those days survive, and that's because you're coming out of an engine room that's 140 degrees, and you're getting in water that's 45 degrees, and heart attacks show up really, really quick. Especially most of those crews were older men, especially the engineers and things. Unless they're in a lifeboat somewhere. Unfortunately, a lot of them don't really survive. Another thing is that you don't see it on here, but almost all these ships, when they sink like that, especially in those days with those boilers, there'll be an explosion because of the cold water rushing on those red hot boilers, and you have an explosion, and it has a tendency to blow people overboard. So, yes, there's a drawing of what she looks like today, sitting on the bottom. So you can see where she's been in an accident right there. It virtually cut her right into. This is a drawing, yes, taken by thousands and thousands and thousands of images that they've taken, and they put them all together, and the artist does a pretty darn good drawing, don't you think?
What are those Great Lakes?
Do you see that's a submergible right there, and there's a diver right there, and there's probably somebody looking inside the pilot house with a high intensity light. See, they discovered her in 1972. She's 1.5 miles north of Whitefish Point. She's in 220 feet of water. You see the capstan right there, this thing that the diver is on. The capstan is what you would put a rope around, and you would turn it to bring a line in or raise an anchor. You see, back in the day, they still had all the holes around it because you could put a board in there and turn it by hand. Most of these were steam operated by this time, by 1910. The capstan usually always had a real pretty brass cover on it with the vessel's name, and you'll see it because that's one of the things they recovered. That's looking at the pilot house windows. You know, it's a steel cabin, but the windows still have wooden frames around them, back in those days. That's the steering wheel on the back end of the boat. That's the emergency steering. You see the stern pictures of the boat. They got a big steering wheel so they could steer it in case there was an accident. Well, that's what's left of the wood is pretty much all gone. I mean, hey, it's been underwater for 109 years. Here's her propeller and rudder. And it stopped turning way back in 1909. This is, if I remember, behind the pilot house. This would be the ladder to go up. The captain, when he's on watch, or the mates, he'd climb up that ladder and go up on top of the pilot house to conduct your business. This is at the museum, Whitefish Point Museum. We were up there about a week ago so I could get some pictures. I went all the way up there to get pictures for this thing. But this is a model of what she looks like. This is what she would have looked like in her prime, John B. Cowell. And you can see, like I said, the Monkey's Island up there, and up on top of the pilot house there. That's where, like I said, that's where they always thought about wooden ships and iron men. You did most of your business on the outside. Like I said, the wheelsman, he got it lucky. He was inside where it was fairly warm, but the guys that were really on watch and commanding the ship had to face it right out in the open there. So.
What's the pole in front of the ball?
That's her steering pole, so you can see where it's at. Yeah, with the buoys, they line it up with the buoys and stuff. Yeah. I think there's come on. Yep, there's a shot from the stern. That emergency steering wheel would be right here today, and you see the cabins go like this in this little spot right here where it's indented in, and it's a lot smaller. That's the coal bunker hatch. That's where they'd be coal-fired vessels, hand-fired vessels at the time, and that's the coal bunkers. So. They'd fill it right full of coal, and the guys downstairs would be down in the engine would be shoveling it in to the engines. I took some pictures. This is some of the stuff that they recovered from the wreck. A few years ago, the museum here got raided by the state of Michigan. Well, these parts, she's part of technically, any of these wrecks that are in Michigan waters belong to the state of Michigan. And you cannot take artifacts off them without special permission for certain things. So they got in real deep trouble for taking some of the artifacts that you see here, and there'll be some more coming up right here. There's that capstan cover right there, and there's her steering wheel from the pilot house, and a whistle off her stack, and a revolution counter up there in the corner from the engine room. They worked out an agreement. I'm sure they paid some pretty good fines, but they worked out an agreement where they would be perpetually loaned to the museum. The state still owns them. So, I mean, if the state walks in and says, we need it back, they can take it back. But it's kind of on permanent loan to the museum up there. But, well, the state would just put it in their collection somewhere, you know what I mean? And do you remember that one in the Raiders of the Lost Ark with all those... Picture that, you know what I'm saying? It would be tucked in some warehouse somewhere and nobody would ever know where it went. Probably. I'm not blaming them, but that's more than likely. Here's our Isaac M. Scott right here. Like I said, this is another Bob McGreevy. I know Bob. I've known him for many, many, many years. He's easily the best artist on the Great Lakes. Here's a picture of the Isaac M. Scott. Isaac M. Scott, like I said, had a real tragic occurrence. She only lived 4 years longer than the John B. Cowell. She was only 4 years old when she was lost in the 1913 storm. She was lost off Harbor Beach. No survivors. She is an exact sister ship to the Charles S. Price, the famous one that's upside down here in the lake. Right out here about where buoys 11 and 12 are. They're consecutive hull numbers apart, so they were built exact for the same company, to the exact same plans, and both of them sank in the 1913 storm.
This was a Jinx one too then?
No, she was built at American Shipbuilding in Lorraine, I believe, if I remember correctly. But she's the one that sank the Cowell. Here she is. They discovered her also just the same year they discovered the Cowell. They found her in 1972. She's found off Harbor Beach in about 240 feet of water, upside down, as most vessels that she had a load of coal on her in the 1913 storm, and most vessels that had light cargoes like grain or coal got flipped upside down in the storm. If they found the wrecks, the grain and coal boats they find are almost always upside down. And one thing, she's missing her rudder, but on most vessels that are upside down, the rudder will be hard to port or to starboard, and that's an indication that the boat was caught in the trough, in the wave, and they've tried frantically to get back out and run across the wave pattern. And gradually what happens is you do this enough and pretty soon the cargo shifts and it causes you to roll over. And that's what happened. The Price is she's full of coal or was full of coal, exact same thing. She's upside down just like it. So, okay. Next one is the most infamous vessel on the Great Lakes. This is the steamer Eastland, which was the only passenger vessel, as I mentioned, that Jenks ever built. She's 275 feet long, she's 38 feet wide, and she had a molded depth of about 19 feet 6 inches, I think. Yeah, unfortunately, the dang thing cut the bow of this off. This is a rough drawing of what she looked like as built. See, 275 by 38, twin screws. Service speed is ordered. They wanted her to be able to do 20 knots, which would be pretty darn fast for a passenger boat. It was actually designed for passenger and freight service. The company that built her, Michigan Steamship Company, she was designed to, in the fall months, to haul fruit from Benton Harbor and South Haven and Grand Haven and take it to Chicago. Remember back then, no roads, no trucks. Limited railroad service. So the ship was a much easier, much faster way to transport fresh fruit to where you wanted it to go. She was only really designed, when she was initially built as the plane, she was only designed to carry 500 passengers. When she rolled over in Chicago, she had 2,500 passengers on her. So she was not really designed to be that heavy of a passenger boat. She was designed to be a daytime excursion boat that carried freight, basically. So also, it says that service speed is ordered as 20 knots. Jenks Shipbuilding, part of the contract stipulated the boat had to be able to do 20 knots or better to get the full amount of money for the contract. Try as they might, the best they could do was 19 knots, so they owed like $10,000 back to the people who built the vessel. And they tried over the years to try to make her a little faster, and never had much luck with it. One of the biggest problems with the Eastland, and it's not necessarily, part of it was the design. She was built to do one thing and they had her doing other things, but it had to do with her ballast tanks, so the arrangement of the freshwater ballast tanks. And as they kept bustling her out a little more up above, putting more cabins on, more lifeboats, more things, to carry more passengers, made her top heavy. So that was one of the big things that contributed to her loss in Chicago when that happened.
How many people died?
835. So you're
At the dock.
at the dock. She was sitting at the dock. She never moved. The water's only 20 feet deep there, and still 800 people died. So here she is, just prior to launching at Port Huron. She's got her propellers on. She was twin screwed, so it helped with the maneuverability. Like in the Chicago River, she was able to maneuver a lot of times without aids of a tug. She's only 275 feet long, so she's about 100 feet longer than the Bramble, if you want to figure it out. The Bramble's 180 feet long, and she's 275. So just to give you an example. Here she is in her last, in 1940, she had a succession of owners. Again, because she wasn't the most stable vessel in the world. They tried her on a bunch of different routes and it didn't work. So she had a succession. She had like 5 or 6 owners, bang, bang, bang. They'd give her for a year or two and then they'd sell her to somebody else and then they'd sell her to somebody else. And then she always kept the same name. But at the end, she was owned by St. Joseph and Chicago Steamship Company and primarily designed to carry passengers as over, an excursion vessel. Chicago at the time, you had, that was like the second largest city in the United States, and no air conditioning, things. The cruises, the moonlight cruises, were extremely popular. You could do it really cheap for a quarter. You could go out for 2 hours or whatever and take a nice cruise and then nice breeze at 18 miles an hour when you get that nice breeze. And by that time you come home, you were nice and relaxed and you could go home and go to bed. So 1915 that this was. She was built in 1903. This is 1915.
Where did the North and South American come into this scene?
1913 and 1914, so just about the same time, yes. They were designed as an overnight passenger boat, though. Had large sleeping accommodations. I'm sorry.
Where were they built?
Great Lakes Engineering Works in River Rouge. Now like I said, you can see the old-fashioned leaded crystal, type windows, the leaded windows. The year before this, the La Follette Steamboat Act started to take effect, and one of the requirements was one more lifeboat on each side. So again, that added more weight and everything, so it affected her stability as she was going. She was always known as a cantankerous vessel. She either had a list some way or, so that's one of the reasons she's been sold so many times. But she had a purpose. She was, there she is with a full load of passengers right there, also taken probably in, well, I'm sorry?
It looks stopped
A little bit, yes it does, but there she is with a full load of passengers. Well, in July of 1915, one of the big, huge employees of Chicago, Western Electric, same people who make telephones and everything, one of their plants, they chartered 4 different steamers, including the Eastland, to take the people there to Michigan City, Indiana on a day excursion. There was a picnic there. The company was providing a picnic, and the boats would dock, and everybody would have a good time. And 7, 8 o'clock at night, they'd all load back on the boats, and away they'd come back home to Chicago. And many of those people there at the company, Western Electric, were immigrants. A lot of them couldn't hardly speak English. A lot of them, they worked 7 days a week, 12-hour days. This is the only chance of actually what we would call a vacation that they were to get. And it was I think the company charged like 25 cents to go or something like that. We'll supply the food and everything, you pay the fare or whatever. And they highly recommended everybody do it. And so they had a very high turnout amongst the people. Like I say, it took 4 ships to, this one has 2,500 people on it alone. So not everybody was an employee, but you can just get an idea how many people were going. There was lots and lots and lots and lots of people going.
And this ship
So
is only used for day use, never overnight.
No, it did have, it did, as it built, it did have a few cabins that people could stand, but no, it was designed for day excursions, right. If you notice too, the open port, the open side ports, how low they are to the water, that later, of course, had a very dramatic effect when she was rolling over in Chicago. There's an early picture of her taken in Chicago, not too far from where she would have rolled over. And you see right there, it says Eastland. See the name right on the side of the building there, and just above her name right there. See Eastland. Yeah, she was very popular in Chicago. She was an excellent boat. She was fairly fast, and she wasn't as big as some of the other boats, so she kind of homey, you know. So she was a very popular boat. People didn't think about stability and safety like that, like you and I would think of it today. So.
After these ships were built, was there still quite a bit of work to do on the upper structure?
Oh yeah, well you saw the boat where it was being launched there. That's how they would have launched it. She had her boilers, or she probably didn't even have her boilers in. Just the hull and the basics. They would launch it, then they would take her to the dock. They'd put her boilers and engines in, and put her cabins on and her stacks and everything. Yep. And fit her all out right there. She'd have got finished there. But like I said, there she is in the Chicago River. Well, this is the day of the accident. This is July 15, 1915. And she was sitting at the dock waiting to leave with the other vessels. This is just shortly after 7 o'clock. They had a 7:30 departure time, and this happened about 7:18. So they were just getting ready to depart when, I don't know if improperly, they never were able to 100% say this is exactly what caused it, but they don't know if people rushed to the side to see something going on, or if they were improperly filled ballast tanks. Remember, on her, it was always keep tanks full and everything to keep the stability, and one might have been a little light. There was a story that she leaned slightly towards the dock, so they turned, ballast tanks over here to straighten up the leak or to the list, and somebody might not have remembered to go turn them back off again. You know what I'm saying? So things like that. Who knows back then what could happen? There's no cameras and no pictures of it actually tipping over anywhere. But within a matter of about 3 minutes, she was laid on her side here. Unfortunately, a lot of the people that died had gone down below to clean up, dress up, a lot of women and children. They would be taking them off the decks because there was areas that the kids could play and things, you know what I'm saying? And so they had already gone down below. So when the boat started rolling over, it didn't take very long before you'd end up trapped and not able to get back out again. And you see the guy standing here by the propeller. It was always a neat picture with the guy standing here. You see them? They got lines going up, the tugboats and everything. They're starting to walk the people back through the boat, back to the dock again. You notice one thing in common today, if that was a cruise, men or women, you'd be dressed like this. You'd be in jeans or something comfortable. You notice they're all full-length dresses and everything. So that really hindered in the thing. When you're in the water, that heavy outfit, most of them had a baby with them, so you weren't very buoyant for very long. Nobody had time to don a life jacket or anything and put them on. So I mean, the outfits that they wore led to, in some ways, especially for the women, led to the high fatality rate, if we say. And there she is. They're bringing the stretchers aboard, and there's workers on board, and by now most of the people are off, but you can see them there. You see how shallow the water is. She's only 38 feet wide, and look how much of her's out of the water. So I'm saying it's not like she sank in 90 feet of water or something, and she sank in a very shallow area right there. So there's not much water right there, and yet she managed to drown 835 people.
Do they have to take divers in to get the bodies out?
Oh, absolutely. I'll see if I think I've got a picture. This is the morgue right here, and this is, some of the people aren't even covered, like this gentleman sitting right here. And this was a very famous picture here, the fireman here, and he's got a child. There was 22, just to give you an example how devastating this was in the city of Chicago, there was 22 families completely wiped out. Husband, wife, kids, everything, gone. 22 families alone. There was 81 women that were widowed. There was 50-some men that were widowed. There was almost 400 kids, 300 kids that were orphaned at that time. So just to give you an idea of how devastating it was. In one area of Western Electric, 80% of the people in the one area that worked there were dead, were gone, were wiped right out. So just to give you an idea of how devastating, virtually everybody in Chicago knew somebody that died on the wreck. You know what I'm saying? Virtually everybody. You got about 1.5 million people, you got 800 people, doesn't take long for virtually everybody to know somebody who was part of that. So like I say, with the morgue here, they're all checking it. I don't know if I put the other morgue where they're trying to identify the bodies. Yeah, you see all the people walking through the morgue here, trying to identify who, so you can figure how many times you'd have to peel something back and say, well, that's not who I'm looking, but that is so-and-so, so help make positive identity. You asked about the divers, there's a hard hat diver right there. There was a group of about 10 divers that went down and not only rescued bodies, or picked up bodies, but also did things like close portholes and things in preparation for her to be salvaged. So sealed openings and the like. I'm sorry? Oh, yeah. Oh, God, yeah. The aqualung, as we know, it was invented by Jacques Cousteau, in the 40s. So this is 1915. Everything back then was a hard hat diver or a diving bell. So absolutely. More pictures of her. There's a picture of the inside, one of the spots inside. And you see the naval personnel, the guy standing up there. I mean, that should be like this, and it's sitting like this. It's laying on her side right there. And like I said, they're starting to erect things. Some of these large poles, it was to help bring bodies out and things. The diver would hook something on and give them a signal, and they'd pull the body out. Yep. So that right there is the Wells Street Bridge right there, that bridge. I'll show it to you in a minute, what it looks like today. Here she is. Great Lakes Towing Company got the contract to do the salvage work, and this is their large wrecker favorite. Favorite is the correct way to pronounce it. She was the largest salvage vessel on the Great Lakes at the time. She was a big, huge behemoth tug that had a large derrick that could lift a large amount of weight. So she came in, and again, like I said, the divers sealed up holes and things so they could pump her out, so they could bring her back to the surface. There's a really interesting picture of her at night there, all lit up back in the days in the old arc lights and things. Again, like I said, 1915, so it's even before, just about the start of World War I. And during the salvage operation, see it here, you see water cascading down the sides of the boat here, and she's getting a little higher. Again, they're pumping water out, and there's the favorite again right there, and she's gradually, slowly coming back up on an even keel. So there's another shot. She's about 2/3 right in here, and here she is. That's what she looked like after she got rightened. She's pretty much stripped, stacks, everything was gone. Just her pilot house remained, believe it or not, which was kind of neat. But most all this stuff, they cut all that stuff away, lifeboats and that, so made it easy to facilitate salvage. But that wasn't the end of her. During World War I, right there on the future, where they said, what do we do with this hull? She's done as a passenger boat. Nobody in his right mind would ever go back on board it as a passenger boat. They figured, hey, we need gunboats to train naval personnel. And the admiral that was in charge of the Illinois Naval Base, which is Great Lakes as we know it today, the Great Lakes Naval Base, just north of Chicago, got a hold of the right people, and the Navy bought her. He actually paid for it, and the Navy reimbursed him for the vessel. She was converted into a gunboat called the Willamette. And for the next 20-odd years, she did a very yeoman job training young naval gunners and naval personnel with seafaring techniques to learn to be a sailor right here on fresh water. And she did a very, very, very good job of that. As come out originally, she had twin stacks as she was built. In later years, in the 1930s, late 1930s, she was given a new, more modern look. Or in the early, actually, it was actually in the 1940s after the war started, and she was still doing her job here. They modernized her. In the 1930s, they converted her to oil firing, and again, that affected her stability problems because the water tanks that they used to keep full, they now use for fuel, and they'd pump oil out and pump oil, and it affected very much her stability. So they ended up filling a couple tanks with water and sealing them off so they couldn't be emptied. And they put about 100 ton of pig iron and things down in the bowels of the ship to keep her more steady. And that seemed to work, and then she never had any more problems. But she used to dock at the Navy Pier. That's where she was headquartered out of, where the Navy Pier is there in Chicago. And like I said, for many, many years she did that. And you get these young guys that came from all over the country, you know, like Nebraska or somewhere, and now you're going to be sailing. They're sailing on a ship they had no idea that had this kind of history to the city of Chicago. After the war was over, she wasn't needed anymore. So just before the war ended, they took her out of service and retired her, and they scrapped her in Chicago in 1946. One of the neat things that she did, in 1921, when she was still on training duty, she is the only actual warship ever, Navy warship on the Great Lakes, to use its guns to sink another ship. This submarine here is the XC-97, and it was a war prize during World War I. This vessel had 12 Allied ships to its credit, and it was turned over at the end of the war. When the war surrendered, when the Germans surrendered, there was several subs and other vessels that were turned over as war prizes to the government. Well, the government took them, and they did a couple things. They did a lot of testing to see why their U-boats were so much better than ours and things. And then, of course, it went on, like, I don't want to say bond tours, but it went around the Great Lakes and other places, you know, to show the enemy vessel, you know, that we work so hard to defeat the enemy, you know. Well, the United States and Japan and Great Britain and those in the 1920s signed on to something called the Washington Treaty. And the Washington Treaty was trying to end all wars. You know, the war to end wars, World War I was considered. So any of the extra warships, things were made to be either demilled or scrapped. So Japan sent a lot of their battleships and things to scrap. Britain sent probably 25 battleships to be scrapped. We sent about a half a dozen or a dozen rather modern battleships to be, and tons of destroyers and frigates and everything to be scrapped. Well, any of these things that were war prizes at the time were part of that Washington Treaty, and they had to be disposed of on or before, I think it was December 31st, 1921. So in early 1921, they took her out about, maybe 5-10 miles north of Chicago, and just, they had stripped her. They took all the things off her, all the brass, all the things that were good. And the 4-inch gun on the deck of the Willamette put about 14 holes in the submarine, and down she went. There's a picture of the submarine laying on the bottom of Lake Michigan. So it's the only submarine that's on the Great Lakes that's sunk. So, and she's still there. She's now a dive site. Once they found where she's at, she's become a popular dive site. But there's the you can see. You see the holes that were cut through through the deckway, and then some of that was by design, and then you can see kind of the oval shape there where her bridge is, her conning tower is. But yeah, she hit it 13 or 14 times with shells, and down she went. She went to the bottom. So, of course, it wasn't much of a fight. She didn't have no torpedoes or could fight back, but you know, she's credited with the only sinking and and what was really funny too, just a little trivia, the two gunnery officers on the Willamette. The chief gunnery officer was the first gentleman to fire a shell, an American shell, during the Spanish-American War. And the other officer was the first gentleman during the Spanish to fire a torpedo, an American torpedo at the enemy. So they both had the honors of, because that was still fresh in everybody's mind, you know. So they had the honors of doing that. So this is where the Eastland rolled over, right here. Wall Street Bridge. My favorite building is Marina Village there, that's in Chicago. The two buildings that look like corn cobs that are standing up, which someday I'm going to own an apartment there. I love that building. I think those two buildings are just absolutely phenomenal. Well, that's where they are. Like I said, there's the bridge, which is still very much in service today. It's right here is where the Eastland was when she rolled over. At one time, Chicago River had lots and lots of traffic. Large freighters would go up to the There was a paper mill up there, well, Chicago Tribune, for instance, just as one, and almost all the power plants and all the buildings were coal-fired, so the ships would bring coal and things to them. Now that commercial traffic is completely gone. Medusa Challenger used to go up and bring cement up there up until the 70s, and she used to cause lots of problems, Medusa Challenger, because sometimes she'd be going up the river, and they have to open like 6 or 7 of these bridges at one time for her to fit. And like the last bridge would have a problem, and she'd stop, and meanwhile she'd have 6 more bridges so the traffic would come to a snarl, you know, because she's got 6 bridges tied up, and the one bridge that doesn't work, and then sometimes she'd have to back out, and they'd have to lower the bridges, and so it was a mess. So they kind of talked to the cement company, build a new silo outside the harbor, you know, so you don't interfere with traffic. Now it's all tour boats and things now. Yes, just about where this is taken, there's a memorial sign there, and there's also a memorial now that they have put up. I don't think it names all the names. There is a memorial somewhere that it's a rather large one that names everybody, but there is a sign right there that you look, you can find it. So.
You know, I see the Duke d'Orleans.
Yeah.
The Duke d'Orleans seems to ride high.
Yes.
And everybody's on one side. And that boat does not look to me like I'd be comfortable on it.
Yeah, well, some vessels have a real high or a real low center of gravity. Here's a real interesting story. Sorry if I'm keeping you too long, but there's a real interesting story about right after the Eastland disaster. You know, people just stopped taking boats anywhere in Chicago. I mean, nope, anybody in their right mind is not going to get on another boat, right? Well, the Goodrich Transit Company owned the whaleback passenger steamer Christopher Columbus. And if you remember the whalebacks, they've got the round decks, you know. She in particular was, you know, she was a lot of rumors about her. I mean, oh man, that's going to roll right over. And the board of directors of Goodrich Transit Company said, we've got to do something or we're going to be in severe financial crisis. So they asked the president directly, if we put a lot of weight on it, is she going to roll over? And the captain and Mr. Goodrich said no. He says, well, we got to do something about this. So, with a bunch of newspaper ads and all the things, you know, they put in that they were going to do a free excursion. You could get on the boat, and they were going to tow it all around the harbor to show that the boat was seaworthy. And they invited, of course, all the politicians and a brass band. And, of course, hardly anybody wanted to, you know, again, in their right mind, wanted to go. So they put 5,000 sandbags on board the boat, and all the sandbags weighed 150 pounds apiece. They figured that would more than average for all the kids and everything else. So she went away from the dock, and she was towed by a tug all day here, just in case something would happen. And of course, her lifeboats were all out, you know, just in case something might happen. They shifted all of those sandbags to the port side. She went, and that's about as far as she went. She listed just slightly, and they towed her all around the harbor all day. Within days, she was back carrying full loads of passengers, where the other boats still took a long time before people worked up their courage to sail. So, I mean, it was a brilliant move on Goodrich Transit Company's part, because she in particular, with the rounded decks, was she was ripe for any kind of criticism, you know, and rightfully so. But yeah, they found out she was probably more stable than any of the other boats. So she was back within like a days carrying passengers again. So, okay, last one on here. And I don't have very many pictures of this, unfortunately, because I have a few. The Cowell, I didn't have many pictures of on the surface. The Steinbrenner, unfortunately, they haven't found exactly where she's at. She's off water, and she's in very deep water. So I doubt very much if anybody's ever going to dive down to her. She's probably in 600 feet or more of water. This is I'm sorry?
What lake?
Lake Superior, off Iowa. You know, you've got the peninsula where it goes up here, and then Isle Royal sits up here. And she's 15 miles south of Isle Royal Light, so she's right in that neighborhood. Henry Steinbrenner was built just before the John B. Cowell was launched, 1903. 1902 is when she was launched for Kinsman Transit Company. It's George Steinbrenner's grandpa, or his daddy, actually. Well, she was named for George Steinbrenner, the baseball Steinbrenner. that was named for his daddy. So you give you an idea. Henry Stein they were in shipping long before baseball. You know, they've owned a steamship company on the Great Lakes since about 1900 or thereabouts. Kinsman Transit Company, still back in the day, still carried the S just like before. Amongst the vessels in their fleet, in 1902, they ordered a 427-footer, Henry Steinbrenner, built right here at Jenks. Again, rather Spartan looking, not super fancy, but very utilitarian, and did its job for many years. If I can get this to... Here's a picture of her taken just about the time she was new, about 1903 or thereabouts. This is at the Sioux. You see how busy the shipping was back then? That's why there was accidents everywhere. Nobody had radar. Nobody had radio telephones. When I wanted to talk to the boat, you'd grab a megaphone and yelled, "Hey, you know, hello, ahoy!" That was the only way you could communicate with people. You know, if you look at the Steinbrenner, you see the guys out there talking to somebody, and then you see the guy up on top, right by the mast up front. You see behind the pilot house, you see the guy up there. It's probably the captain or mate that's in command of the vessel, and the guy down below would be steering the vessel. He'd be in the pilot house there. You notice also she had 2 masts along the deck as built there. She was not designed as such, but many vessels of that era, as you see the vessel next door to John W. Gates, she also has spars down the deck. Many of these vessels earlier carried sails. The barge that you see behind her right there with the tug, you see those are sails. Those are parts for her sails along the top of the deck. This is a steel-hulled barge right here, but these are sails right here. So if she gets away from her tug, say in a storm, she at least can defend herself. She can raise her sails and try to reach port. Otherwise, she would just waller around back there. Yes, there are. Yeah, I'm sorry. It's wrapped around the boom, and then there's the mast. Oh, and correct. That's why I said she didn't have sails. She's about 10 years older than the last vessels powered steamers that carried sails. But I don't know. I don't know. I didn't know if they did it for stability or what. But within a couple years, they became in the way of the unloading equipment. So most of the boats got rid of their masts that were along the deck. That was one of the things that set the Great Lakes freighters apart from saltwater ships and stuff. Most of the time in saltwater ships, you had a large cabin. Sorry, I don't mean to get in everybody's way, but you had like a large cabin here, and then you had a little cabin on the back end, and you had a real high bluff bow. And you had cargo space up here, and some of them you had it behind the cabins. The Great Lakes ships, they found that having a nice open cargo hold was much easier to load and unload. Back in these days, everything was loaded with a chute, you know, that dropped down and you dropped ore into the cargo hold. And they were unloaded at this era. They were unloaded either by what we call a brown hoist, which is a boom that went out with a clamshell on the bottom, or what we call a Hewlett unloader, which was a kind of a big, huge mechanical arm with a grab on it, and it would go down in the cargo hold and pick the ore up and deposit it in railroad cars or on the dock. They found this stuff was very much a hindrance to unloading it, so they did away with it. Same thing with the cabins here. They found it worked best on the Great Lakes to as uncluttered a deck as possible, and so that's why you see them. Now, in a few years, like this boat here, John W. Gates, this is owned by. Later, it was owned by U.S. Steel Corporation. It was taken over in 1901, and U.S. Steel ended up. This is I think Pittsburgh Steamship Company owned it, and of course, it amalgamated into what we know as U.S. Steel. John W. Gates was famous for having 2 dog houses on the deck, and they're a little cabin that stretched across the deck, where deckhands and things were. Some boats only had 1. She was one of the oddballs that had 2. Most of these boats had rather large crews, even though they weren't that big. John W. Gates was 470 feet long. You know, she's 430 feet long, roughly. R.L. Ireland's 430 feet long. These vessels would have 35 men in a crew, because everything was all manual. In the engine room, the guys would be shoveling coal, and you had lots of deckhands and stuff. And in 1915, the La Follette Steamboat Act came out. And back in the days before this, guys worked like an 8-hour shift, just like you or I did. But what they did is they divvied everything up into 4-hour shifts. So you had three, you worked 4 hours and you were off 8. And then the next guy came on and worked 4 and was off 8. And by the time it was done, you're back to working. So they required larger crews. So that was one of the reasons for the extra cabins and stuff that later got, most of the boats ended up putting like another cabin up here, which was called a penthouse, doghouse on the deck, but a penthouse back here. And again, that held usually for extra firemen, and the one on the deck was for extra deck hands and things that they would need. These boats were all strictly manual labor. You can see here, this must be a nicer day. The hatches are open. You see the hatches? She's going out into the lake with open hatches. You see these hatches here. These hatches right here were in most cases, a lot of the older boats were wooden planks that were built to fit in a channel, and they would fit in fairly tight, and then they would put a tarp over them, a tarpaulin, and then put wedges and things in to drive it to create a watertight seal. That's very important with the Henry Steinbrenner accident in a minute, which I'll explain. But a lot of times you saw the boats when they were out and it was nice weather. Like this, our Ireland might be, just as an example, going somewhere to the Soo here to pick up a cargo, or over to Sault Ste. Marie. So they're starting to get the hatches open. As an example, would be a reason for this. Usually vessels, when they travel out into the lakes, they, as much as possible, try to seal these cargo holds up as much as possible. But these are very labor intensive. You'd have maybe 4 or 5 guys, 6 guys working on this to put the hatches on. And even though this boat's only got like 12 or 13 hatches, it might take 2 or 3 hours or more of really hard work to get all the hatches on. Then it would probably take another 2 to 3 hours to get the tarps all put back on and wedged in and stuff. So it was a very, very labor intensive job. Later years, many years in the later, they started putting one-piece steel hatch covers on, one big steel cover, and it had a crane that went along the deck here, a hatch crane as they called it, and it would pick the hatch up and put it on. And then they used dogs, kind of like a big C-clamp that would go over, and they could tighten it down and take a wrench and tighten it down, and it would form a tight seal. All the new big ships that you see today use that type of principle today. They don't do, although we do have a couple really old boats, Saginaw for instance, they're still done this way with the tarps and everything. They still have to seal the hatches up every time like that. But I'll just give you an idea of what they look. Very Spartan, not a whole lot of aesthetics to them. These 2 tanks here are water tanks, so they can drink potable water and flush the toilet and all the stuff, things of that nature. And this is the skylight to the engine room. That was the only light most of the time they got in there during the daylight. And then they had oil lamps or very early electric lights and things at the end. These are ventilators here. There's no air conditioning on those boats. So they could turn those to go into the wind or turn them away from the wind if they wanted, like in the middle of the winter. And that brought fresh air into the engine room and things, so it wasn't hot. Average engine room, about 130 degrees, so it's great in the winter, but man, it was sure really tough in August. So, okay, well here, like I said, here she is leaving the Soo, and like I said, amazing how much traffic is there, but that would be just a normal day there, so back then. In 1909, she had the misfortune of colliding with the Harry A. Berwyn in the St. Mary's River. Now, what's really funny, she's a Port Huron built vessel. The Harry A. Berwyn and Port Huron never got along very well. This steamer, what I mean by that, the Harry Berwyn was built in 1908, had a long life. It was active till 1980. She had a connection with Port Huron quite well known. The Berwyn, in many years later, was called the Parker Evans. Anybody remember the Parker Evans? Parker Evans sank the Sidney Smith just south of the Blue Water Bridge. In 1951, it sank the George F. Rand right at the mouth of Black River. 6 weeks after she sank the Sidney Smith just off Harbor Beach, she collided with another vessel. So she had a real interesting relationship with the city of Port Huron, But in 1909 in the St. Mary's River, they had a collision, and Port Henry Steinbrenner sank to the bottom. Wasn't deep enough to sink the boat underwater completely, but it sank her right up to the deck. The kinsman originally abandoned her as a total loss to the underwriters, but whatever their insurance payment was, it was cheap enough to buy it back from them and pay to have it salvaged. And of course, they salvaged her, and she went back into service again. So you see the boat out in front and everything there. She's got a gaping hole in her bow, but within a week or so, she was back up. Now you see her a few years later. This is about 1915. This is just about the year that the Eastland sank. You see the raised pilot house up there. No longer is the guy out in the open. After the 1913 storm, it didn't become mandatory, but most owners said, hey, that was one of the big contributing factors, they thought. The lake carriers and that said that, you got crews that are cold and numb and they don't respond as well. And, bring us into the 18th or 19th century back then. They started enclosing the pilot houses. They put a new pilot house. Most of those pilot houses were wood, but at least now everybody was inside, and they no longer steered from the bottom. Everything was moved up. The steering wheel, and everything was brought up the higher deck. And they found, hey, this is even better because we can see a whole lot better. The wheelsman can see where he's going now instead of being down close to the deck. So this became the norm. Many ships, 80% of them ended up with at one time new pilot houses and the like, as she is. You see looks like a string running down the length of the deck? That is called the lifeline. When you're out there checking hatches or, hey, it's time to eat, you hook yourself onto that line with and thank you. And put a line around your waist, and that kept you from being washed overboard, from being lost at sea. I'm sorry? Similar, yeah. There's been a lot of people wash overboard not tied into those lines, so that became a life. And they're not used today, but the older boats, you might see something like the Alpina or one of the older boats rig something like that. Today's newer boats, they have inside passageways now, so it's enclosed. So if you want to walk aft, great. It's 60 degrees and it's not bad, and you can walk safely, and it's lit and everything, so they're a lot safer. But back then, those days, the only way out, or if she's sinking or she's got a problem, you had to hook onto the lifeline to keep from getting washed overboard. And of course, that again happens, as we explain in just a minute. Here's another shot. In later years, again, you see where I was telling you about the penthouse? Again, bigger cruise. See, now she's got a second cabin up above here. So this, like I said, they call this the penthouse. And she's got a new enclosed steel pilot house now. It's not as high as the other one, and it's steel, and it's a whole lot nicer, a lot more room inside it. She sank in 1951, so that would be just about the era of radar and radio telephones and all the other stuff. So they need the room up there because, again, you're adding a lot more navigation equipment. That darn Michigan State flag up there. They stole it from Kinsman. Or vice versa, I'm not sure. Here's a little bit later shot. This is taken right here at Port Huron. I don't know if you can see it, but in the original picture, you could see the part of the bridge behind it right there. But she's downbound here at Port Huron. And again, this is about 1947, 1948. So she's still earning her keep with Kinsman and still doing a very, very good job. Capacity about 7,000 ton, which would be about adequate. It was adequate till the late 1950s. If she would have had a normal career, she would have lasted till probably late 50s, early 60s before she would have went for scrap, because her size would have just said, this is not, or they would have sold her to the Canadians, and the Canadians would have used her in the grain trade for a few years, like they did with a lot of these. And early 60s, she would be gradually sent to the scrapyard. But again, she carried on. In her last trip, May 10th, she loaded, I think it was at Two Harbors, she loaded iron ore for delivery to Cleveland, if I remember right. And she was downbound. Well, Captain Steglin, nice beautiful May day, you know, what the heck, this is getting spring. They put the leaves on, but they didn't put the tarps on anything. And within, 6 hours or so after leaving the confines of 2 harbors, bingo, now all of a sudden there's 80-mile-an-hour winds and 20-foot seas. And her number 11 hatch worked its way loose. Some of the leaves did. So they turned into the wind so the guys could get out there, and they re-secured some of the hatches, the leaves. But later, early the next morning, not only that, but 2 more hatches started leaking also. So she started taking water, considering anything that basically came over the deck went right down in the thing. And they ran pumps, but that's not adequate enough for that much water coming through those giant openings. So about 7 o'clock in the morning, the captain sent out a distress call that she was sinking. We needed immediate help. And just luckily, there were several vessels in the vicinity. There was the Joseph H. Thompson, which is the tug barge that you see today. Joseph, at the time, it was the largest freighter on the Great Lakes. She responded to the distress call. And the Wilfred Sykes, another which would have been one of the largest vessels on the Great Lakes, she also responded. The DM Clemson and a couple other vessels all were in the general vicinity, so they raced to the scene to see what they could do to help. By that time, she was already gone. She went to the bottom. Luckily, the crews managed to get, they launched both of the lifeboats and they launched the raft. There's a raft up there, and I don't think, sorry if I go back one. I don't think I can go back. Just a second, we'll see. No, most boats of this era had a big life raft up on top of the pilot house right here. Oil drum, what we call an oil drum raft. And it's wood slats and 4 oil drums, and that has saved more people's lives on shipwrecks than lifeboats ever have on the Great Lakes, those rafts. You'll see one in a minute in the picture. But the forward end crew managed to get, part of the crew got on the raft, and then the aft crew started launching the lifeboats. And still, she sank so fast that 17 drowned. They survived. There was like 10 survived. Oh, there was like 16 survived, but 17 drowned. So, I mean, they were able to get some people off, but again, she sank so fast that they didn't have any choice. Here's one last picture of the Steinbrenner here. See, she's got a little bit more modern. There's a radio direction finder there, so she's starting to get modern. Again, you needed the bigger pilot house to house the equipment. There's the oil drum raft right there. And there's the guys, this is taken off of the Joe Thompson. There's very, very, very few, and of course there was no pictures of her sinking, unfortunately. But here's several of the guys. One of the guys, this guy right here, is already dead. He had already succumbed. The raft had a lot more people on it, but it got flipped over, and several people lost their grip. And Captain Steglin is, I don't know which one, but he's one of the guys right here. And they were the only survivors from the forward end. And the two lifeboats were also recovered. One only had 2 people in it, but the other one had like 6 or 7 guys in it that managed to survive the storm. And then a couple of boats picked up a handful of the bodies that were still floating in the lake. But again, that was a wake-up call. Don't leave port with the hatches undone. And, that was kind of the last straw. Now they require, if you're going to go out in anything that May is May, but it's still too early to, this is not July or August. They still have storms, and cover the hatches. And then, like I said, the older boats, many of the older boats right after that went in and got new, during their next rebuild, got new one-piece steel hatch covers and things, which made them a lot more modern. It gave them another 10 or 12 years active service for the few dollars that it cost to make them safer. They had a lot longer life ahead of them. So that is the last picture. So does anybody? Sorry, I thought I'd be way too long. Anyways, but does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
I just have a little story. When I was
Sure.
17, I was on a date with my
Yeah.
future husband. We went on the Belle Isle boat, and we were, somebody on the top level took his shoes off and jumped in. And everybody, of course, ran over to the other side just to check him out, and there goes the boat. So they made us really quickly, everybody get into the center of the boat and stand
Right. Oh, it can accept, any of that type of stuff can really affect center of gravity. Anytime you see like a fishing trawler or any of that stuff that's going to be pulling nets or bringing stuff from the side, oh, there's tons and hundreds of calculations. How much stability with this much fuel? How much without this much fuel? How much, how much with this? How much fish does she have down in the down below? It's a very, very serious game, and vessels can be very tender. Back in the 1940s, another little history, there was a tug and a barge. The tug admiral was pulling an oil barge called the Cleveco, which was owned by Cleveland Tankers, a little 260-foot steel-hulled tank barge. And they, Cleveland Tankers had just bought the Admiral earlier that summer to pull that barge around. That barge was originally owned by Standard Oil, and Cleveland Tankers bought it, and they needed a tug. So they bought a harbor tug that was in the port of Milwaukee, and they modernized it. Well, it needed more than the 7 men that was on it when it was in Milwaukee, so they enlarged the cabins and everything, again, affecting its stability. The Coast Guard said she'd be fine to pull the barge around as long as the tow line went right straight aft. So that was fine and dandy. 1942, she loaded gasoline in Toledo, headed for Cleveland. There was about 8 guys on the barge. Early the next morning, they went out to check the lines and everything, and it's like, we're now going into the wind, or we're now being right into the wind, and we're obviously not moving. They went a little closer. Tow line went right straight down in the water. So, meaning the tug had sunk and she was hooked to the tug. So she wasn't going anywhere, she was stuck. So they radioed a distress call. Well, it gets worse. They radioed a distress call that, hey, we're stuck here, So Great Lakes Towing and them said, we'll send tugs out to get you. Fine and dandy, but in the meantime, a bad snowstorm came in. And somewhere during, whether they cut the barge loose or it broke, the cable broke. Now they got to where she was supposed to be. She wasn't there anymore. So she was drifting somewhere. The Coast Guard's cutter Ossipee saw her 2 or 3 times during the storm, hey, there she is over there. And they never did get a hold of her. And she vanished, the barge, no survivors from either thing, from either vessel. In 1961, lo and behold, they found the barge, the Cleveco, upside down, literally at the entrance to the Cleveland Harbor right there. She was a menace to navigation because she was in such shallow water, the deep drafted vessels could hit it. She was just outside the shipping channel. So they raised it and towed it out into deep water and sank it again and allowed it to sink because it wasn't worth it and it had no value. And about 25 years ago, they found the tug, Admiral, on the bottom. And if you go to, I think Dawson's has some of the parts, and I think the one that's in Toledo, there's a toolbox out of the engine room, and there's some other parts, and they say Admiral stamped right on them, or stenciled right on them, that they took out of the engine room. But yeah, the tug got tender, and it got just right. The tow line got off center and flipped the tug right over. So that center of gravity is really important. Yeah.
Now, whatever happened to the Highlander Sea, and why didn't Port Huron get rid of it?
Good question. I think one of the biggest problems, and I don't, but the expense of keeping her here and keeping a crew, I think they didn't have enough experienced crew to actually do what they really wanted to do, where they wanted to go out and do the Highlander Sea, the big sailing ship that was here. Yeah, she's 120 foot long or whatever. I think they didn't have enough experienced people here to operate the vessel, because their object was to do kind of like what the Gray Fox does to the Sea Cadets, go out and they can learn and stuff. You need lots of people with lots of experience to do that, and I think that was the biggest tipping point. I think that they couldn't find people that wanted to come up here and work. Yeah, it's in New York City. It's being made into a restaurant. It's been made into a restaurant. It's near the Bronx or something, somewhere there, and they're using her as a restaurant. Yes, ma'am.
How many freighters or ships are on the Great Lakes at one time?
Well, just to get, If you'd be looking at, say, 1970, just for instance, there was about 600 ships on the Great Lakes, Canadian and American. We had ships everywhere. Today, there's about 120. The big ships is what really spelled the end of it. Like these little boats, that Henry Steinbrenner, 7,000 tons. That's nothing. You can't possibly make money on that. You've got boats, they carry 20 and 30,000 tons, and they go for scrap because they're not economical. The more cargo you can move for the less amount of money, that's what it takes nowadays. So these 1,000-footers, one of these 1,000-footers replaced, they used to say the standard 600-foot ship that we used to have, 1,000-footer replaced 5 of those, and there's 13,000-footers. So they got rid of 50 of those boats right off the bat. And there's less places to haul it to. At one time, there was up like the Cuyahoga River, there was 5 or 6 steel mills, and down in Chicago, Gary, and that there was steel mills everywhere. They're gone. So where do they need the cargoes for?
So how many 1,000-footers are on the lake?
13.
Oh, 13.
Yes.
Well, how do these salties survive? It's so exciting when you see a salty.
The salties, well, the salties, the reason that they're doing fine is it's good and it's bad all of the same. They're usually bringing low-cost steel in, Chinese steel. They dump it on the market over here, that low-cost steel. That's one of the reasons that they come in. Most of those boats bring steel products in and drop them off at like Cleveland or Detroit. Some of them bring rotor blades for the windmills. Yep, the wind turbines. Yep, exactly. For the wind turbines, they bring those in or other parts for them. A lot of the vessels haul grain out of here, and for ports, in Europe and Africa, and even though they're saltwater ships, you see those boats that say Federal, they all have a name, Federal, like Federal Barents or Federal Saguenay and whatever. They're all foreign registered, but they're actually Canadian owned. Paul Martin and the Honorable Paul Martin, the former Prime Minister, he owns the fleet. So he owns Canada Steamship Lines and he owns Federal Commerce and Navigation. So technically, it's a Canadian fleet. It's just foreign registered because if you're a captain and you're from Barbados, you make $80,000 a year. You're a captain from Canada, you make $150,000 a year. So they don't have to have as many crew. They don't have to pay them as much. Unlike the Canadians, where you'd have the union representation and all that stuff. So they foreign flag everything because it's just cheaper.
Landlocked countries more.
Well, and Canadians did away with the tariffs on tax. A few years ago, you noticed Canada Steamship Lines in Algoma started buying all new boats. They're all Chinese or Croatian. They did away with the tax. There used to be a tax to save the shipyards in Canada from competition, much like we have the Jones Act in the United States that says you can't, like say a Canadian boat can't pick up ore in Duluth and take it to Detroit. They can take it to a Canadian port or pick up something in Canada and bring it to an American port, but they can't do interstate commerce, with a foreign vessel. Well, the Canadians did away with the tariff. So now all the shipyards closed in Canada because it was cheaper. One ship built in Canada was $100 million. They can have 3 of them built in Croatia for the same amount of money. So what are they going to do? They're not nearly as well built, but the owners say, hey, if I can get 20 years out of it, what do I care? In 20 years we're going to replace it anyway. So it's just a write-off, and that's exactly what they do. And so they're cheap.
I have a question. The Texas House, where did they get the name the Texas House?
Good question. Back when ships started being built like that in the 1850s, 1840s, Texas was the largest territory in the United States. Well, that was the largest cabin on the ship, so that's where it got its name, Texas.
You said the men they started, I know, to be captains, they had to start at the lowest position, and they were called
Hosspipers. Yeah.
Where's the Hosspiper?
That's where the anchor hung. That's that tube where the stock of the anchor goes up, and the Hosspipe. So they said you started there and worked your way to the top. So yes.
Do you know anything about this tour boat that goes through the German tour boat?
The Hamburg? Yeah. She's been on the lakes for about 15 years now. She was called the Sea Columbus for a lot of years. And passengers usually fly from Germany or somewhere over and get on her in Toronto. And then they spend a week or 2 weeks or whatever. And they do Chicago and up to the Sioux. And I think they go clear up to Duluth maybe, Mackinac Island, those areas. If you look at her, how odd shape she is, she's kind of odd. She's built specifically to trade in and out of the Great Lakes. Her lifeboats are inside because she's made to fit into the Welland Canal, and so she doesn't get them scraped on the lock walls or anything. So everything is designed to fit the Welland Canal. She's 78 feet wide, the lock's 80 feet wide, so she's made to fit just exactly there. Now, in the wintertime, when she's done cruising here, she goes all over the world. She goes into Germany, she goes to Australia, all over the place. But she was built with cruising into the Great Lakes in mind, and that's where.
We haven't developed one for us.
They tried. Well, we tried. That one that just went by. What the heck did they call it? Victory One was actually built by the people who used to own the Delta Queen. Remember the Delta Queen on the Mississippi? They built all these boats, and then what happened? 9/11 came, and it bankrupted the company. You couldn't travel. And not only that, the Delta Queen, I won't mention what senator, but let's not go there. But he was a no vote as to the Delta Queen running on the Mississippi because she has a wooden interior. She has steel, she's sprinklered, but she's always, since 1965, she's always been given a reprieve. There's an exemption because she's never out of sight of land. She's always less than a mile offshore wherever she goes. So the object was, hey, she's sprinklered, she's got every modern fire safety device you can think of. She's not going to be much fire doors, everywhere. She's not going to be a problem. Well, don't ask me what. He probably had secret money in another competitive company. Well, there was a no vote, and she lost, and she'd been taken out of service, so she can't run anymore on that trade. Well, like I said, that happened. They had like 3 new boats at 9/11. They had 3 or 4 new boats being built, and again with the problems in the world, all of a sudden people couldn't come here with the passport problems and all the other stuff. It bankrupted the company. So they were forced to sell off all the ships. Some of them went for scrap, some of their older boats, some were converted. This one that came in here, Victory One, she came to the lakes during 9/11. Well, the month before 9/11. She was in the Welland Canal when the Seaway authorities lowered the bridge on the wind dock and knocked the pilot house off. She was trapped. She couldn't go any further, so she was trapped just below where that was. So I got pictures of when I went to get pictures. I got pictures of her there. She had to pick everybody up and turn around and head back to where she came from because she couldn't go any further. And then, like I said, literally a month later, that was 8/11, 9/11. Bingo, you had New York problem, and then that spelled the end of those cruise lines. There was probably 10 or 12 cruise lines go out of business because of that. The trouble securing passengers. It's better now, but it wasn't right then. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, oh yeah. So they're foreign registered. They're not even American registered anymore. Yes.
I've noticed over the years that you see a lot more of the tug-driven barges
Mm-hmm.
than you used to. They're just taking the hulls of all these old boats and refitting them.
Yeah,
with the tug.
yeah.
And what is the advantage of that?
Well, for a while there was a substantial advantage. You take a look at like a 1,000-footer, 28 guys on the boat, the same size as a tug and barge, 8 or 9. So if everybody makes just a median salary of $50,000 a year, that's a lot of money. Bingo. Second thing was, as a tug and a barge, they didn't have to be dry docked every 5 years like the big ships. They were undocumented. So tugs and barges up until recently were considered a non-documented vessel. They didn't have to undergo dry docking like the ships. Every 5 years, one of these ships that go by like 1,000 has to go on dry dock and be inspected by, you know, underwater inspections and that. The boats still have the Coast Guard come aboard and check things, safety equipment. We don't have to spend that money every 5 years. So, yes?
If the state of Michigan doesn't have a museum, don't they give licenses like to Whitefish Point to have the?
Yes, I don't know if it's a license, but it's some sort of a contract that, hey, you do this for 20 years, 10 years, 50 years, whatever it is, you know, or it might just be an open-ended, contract. Example, me being president of Lake Huron Lore, the Marine Society, we put on whistles on the water every year. We just did it in September, you know, down in St. Clair, where the steam whistles, live steam we use, and you can hear the whistles. Last year, we had the Chief Wawatam, the big car ferry up there, her whistle there. Well, she was owned by the state. That whistle belongs to the state. So you can, through the right channels, you can contact them and say, hey, we would like to borrow this for this reason, blah, blah, blah. And they can say, okay, you've got 30 days or whatever to return it, and you do your thing, and you send it back to them. So, you know, you could do that with artifacts. You want to set up something for a show, you can borrow them and then send them back. Yes?
But what other museums besides Whitefish, I think, in the state, I mean, the Dawson and up in.
Oh, I think all museums do it one time. Yeah. Yeah, the very early stuff, like in the museum here, if that was taken off like in 1940 or something, you know, it was finders, keepers, losers, weepers. That was only since the mid-1970s, because they started stripping all these old wrecks, you know, and taking everything. And a lot of them are grave sites. You know, you got 30 people still on this boat or 20 people still on this boat, you know, skeletal remains. So it'd be like vandalizing Lakeside. So they will bring certain things up. Edmund Fitzgerald, they brought the bell up, but they put another bell with all the people's names on it, a memorial back right exactly in the same spot, and they brought the bell up. In situations like that, she is so incredibly deep, nobody gets to enjoy it at all. You know, if they're wrecked, it's only in, 90 or 100 feet of water, everything is sacred because the divers can still go and see it and enjoy it and things. But like in the case of the Fitz, that's a special occasion. And she's in Canadian waters, so you have to get permission from the Canadian government to go on it. State of Michigan has no control over it. The Canadians, most people didn't, because she's at 530 feet of water, most people left her alone. Jacques Cousteau dove on her when they came in back in the early 80s, and then what really sealed the fate of the Fitzgerald as far as being able to see what was going on, 2 divers from Illinois, I think it was, practiced for a year doing deep saturation dives with scuba gear, with special breathing gear, and they dove on her. And then, of course, once the government, Canadian government especially, found out, they took all the rights away. They wouldn't allow any people to dive on it anymore. It's off limits. You cannot dive on it. It's much like a war site. You know, if you had a battleship or something that sunk, the government says it's off limits. You can't, unless you're, the History Channel or something making a documentary, they can do it, but nobody else can. Well, Fitzgerald's in the same boat. If Jacques Cousteau's group came back to do their, Robert Ballard wanted to do something, yep, they would give them permission, but nobody else, nope, you're not gonna. It's too technical of a dive anyways. Yes, ma'am.
There's a ship that's been anchored out on the
Out-
horizon.
Yeah,
Red salty, it's
Yeah.
beautiful on a
Yeah.
sunny day.
Yes.
It's like a beacon.
yes.
But it's been there at least 10 days. What would be the reasons? I've heard it's waiting for a berth, it's waiting
That's-
for a cargo.
That's usually, or waiting for the cargo. They're probably both, but more than likely in her case, where she's been there for 10 days, she's more than likely waiting for a cargo. Being a chemical tanker, they may be making a special something or rather, some special sulfuric acid, but instead of 30% concentrated, it's got to be 20%. So it has to be custom made for it. Then when the cargo's ready, she'll go back down and load it and then go. Salties a lot of times will spend time up here because they don't have enough pilots. During the busy time of the season, you got 30 ships in the lakes, saltwater ships everywhere. those pilots, much like a pilot on an airplane, you can only work so many hours. So by the time a pilot goes, say, to Detroit, he takes an all-day trip to Detroit. He's got to spend basically 8 hours not doing anything. He could sleep in a hotel, get back on the next morning on a boat and bring it back to Port Huron, but then he's got to go 8 hours again before he does anything. And you get taxed, you know, when you got a limited amount of crews, you can only do that so often before you need a break. And that's what happens. They're usually taxed right to the max, and so these boats will sit for a while. And Goderich too.
For 10 days or.
Yes, it's not normally 10 days, no. Every now and then you'll see one of the Canadians sitting out here, and they're waiting for at Ciflo Salt in Goderich for space. Ciflo went on strike, so that was one of the big things. And then a few years ago they had a tornado run through there and tear part of the machinery out. So again, there was no salt hauled for a while. There could be repairs. So instead of going all the way up to the yard, it's easier just to sit on a hook out here. So yes, ma'am. I'm sorry.
We're like 45 minutes over now. I know everyone has lots of questions, and I don't know if you'd be available to
Oh, sure.
a little bit and talk to people, but you have to pass.
You can. Thank you. You can find me